My mom gave me 2 hours to leave for being pregnant and change the locks. Now she is begging to be in our lives after seeing the Swiss dad and his 10,000 a month support. There is a very specific sound that a deadbolt makes when it locks you out of your own life forever. It is a heavy, sharp, metallic click that echoes in your ears with a terrifying finality. I was exactly 18 years old when I heard that sound, standing on the cracked concrete porch of my childhood home. The October wind was biting, cutting right through the thin, oversized gray sweater I was wearing to hide my growing belly. At my feet sat two large, black plastic garbage bags. They were not even the heavy-duty kind. They were the cheap, thin ones that tear if you look at them wrong. Inside those two bags was everything I owned in the entire world. A few pairs of faded jeans, some oversized t-shirts, a handful of socks and underwear, a worn-out copy of Jane Eyre, and a small stuffed brown bear my dad had given me for my 7th birthday before he passed away. That was it. That was the sum total of my 18 years of existence, reduced to literal trash bags sitting on a cold porch. Just 30 minutes prior, my mother, Diane, had been standing in our hallway with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. When I had finally gathered the courage to tell her I was pregnant, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words, I had foolishly hoped for a mother's embrace. Or, if not an embrace, at least a mother's panic. I wanted her to yell, to ask what we were going to do, to take charge the way mothers are supposed to do when their children are in trouble. Instead, I got pure, freezing ice. She looked me up and down, staring at her own flesh and blood, and told me I was a complete and utter disgrace. She said I had ruined her reputation in the neighborhood, that I was no better than the trash in the alley behind the grocery store, and that I was going to be a massive burden that she absolutely refused to carry. Then, she looked at the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, smoothed down the front of her expensive blouse, and delivered the ultimatum that would completely destroy and then redefine the next 5 years of my life. She gave me exactly 2 hours to pack my things and get off her property. 2 hours to figure out how to survive in the bleak, massive world with a baby growing inside my stomach. I honestly thought she was trying to scare me. I sat in my bedroom, staring at the walls covered in my high school debate team ribbons, thinking she was just trying to teach me some twisted, cruel lesson in tough love. I packed slowly, waiting for her to walk in and tell me to unpack, to tell me we would figure it out together. But she never came. When I dragged those bags out to the front step, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, she stepped out just long enough to push me over the threshold. She slammed the heavy wooden door so hard the glass panes rattled in their frames. And then, the deadbolt turned. That click. I will never, ever forget that click. She changed the locks while I sat right there on the top step, shivering in the wind, wrapping my arms around my stomach, waiting for a change of heart that simply never came. Sometimes, I look around my living room today. I look at the custom-designed furniture, the warm recessed lighting, the thick rugs, and the Swiss billionaire sitting on my expensive couch reading a pop-up storybook to our 5-year-old daughter. And I can still feel the freezing cold of that concrete porch seeping deep into my bones. The contrast is almost enough to give me physical whiplash. But back then, on that porch, there were no billionaires coming to save me. There were no rescue operations, no safety nets, no emergency funds. There was just me, an unborn baby, and a world that suddenly felt incredibly dark and incredibly dangerous. I had absolutely nowhere to go, not a single dollar in my pocket, and a mother who was already busy picking up the phone to tell our extended family that I had run off with a bad crowd to become a dancer in Las Vegas, completely erasing my struggle and my existence just to save her own face at the Sunday church service. The baby, the little life that was about to turn my universe completely upside down, was the result of a brief, chaotic, and desperately lonely moment during my freshman orientation week at college. I was a nerdy, quiet, highly anxious girl who had spent her entire high school career buried under a mountain of textbooks. I had fought tooth and nail to win a partial academic scholarship so I could finally escape Diane's overbearing, highly critical, and emotionally exhausting household. During that first week on the massive university campus, surrounded by the intoxicating, terrifying freedom of college life, I made a choice that was completely out of character for me. I went to a fraternity mixer in a dark, sweaty basement. I was overwhelmed by the loud music and the sheer number of people, and I had exactly 2 cheap plastic cups of whatever bright red punch they were serving out of a plastic cooler. That is where I met him. He introduced himself simply as Felix. He had a thick, incredibly charming accent that he told me was Swiss, and he wore clothes that looked entirely too tailored and expensive for a sticky college basement party. He looked like he belonged on a yacht, not leaning against a cinderblock wall near a keg. But there was a kindness in his eyes that disarmed me immediately. We ended up walking away from the noise, sitting on the back concrete stairs of the fraternity house, talking for hours under a single flickering yellow porch light. He was funny, totally self-deprecating, and he listened to me talk about my favorite classic novels as if I were the most fascinating, brilliant person he had ever met in his entire life. Nobody had ever looked at me like that. Nobody had ever paid that much attention to my thoughts. One thing led to another, fueled by the punch, the freedom, and a desperate, aching desire to feel seen and loved for the first time in my 18 years. It was a one-night thing. A monumental, life-altering mistake wrapped in a few hours of genuine warmth. I woke up extremely early the next morning in his dorm room. The sun was barely coming up, and an overwhelming wave of panic and intense guilt crashed over me. I was a scholarship student. I was not the kind of girl who did this. I gathered my clothes as quietly as possible and slipped out of his room before he even opened his eyes, closing the door softly behind me. I did not know his last name. I had not saved his phone number in my cheap flip phone. I did not even know what his major was. He was just Felix from Switzerland. I walked back to my dorm in the crisp morning air, silently vowing to bury the memory forever. 2.5 months later, the morning sickness started. It was not just a little nausea. It was a violent, exhausting sickness that left me laying on the bathroom floor tiles of my dorm. The panic that set in was a living, breathing monster sitting heavy on my chest. I tried to find him on campus. I spent weeks scanning the massive crowds outside the dining halls, sitting near the library steps, looking for that specific smile or that tailored coat. But it was a massive state university with over 40,000 students walking in every direction. For all I knew, he was an exchange student who had already gone back to Europe. When the free campus clinic officially confirmed the pregnancy with a stark white piece of paper, the ground completely dropped out from under me. The nurse handed me a pamphlet, but I could not read the words. I knew instantly that I had to drop out. I knew I was about to lose my hard-earned scholarship, my future career, and the tiny, fragile bit of independence I had scraped together. When I took that bus ride home to confess to Diane, I was hoping against hope that the woman who gave birth to me would offer just a single shred of grace. I thought she would be angry, but I thought she would be a mother. Instead, she handed me those 2 trash bags and that 2-hour deadline. I vanished from the university system the very next day, too deeply ashamed to reach out to the few casual friends I had made, becoming an absolute ghost at the age of 18. The 5 years that followed that day on the porch were an absolute, unvarnished, unrelenting hell. When people who have never been poor talk about poverty, they often use abstract terms. They talk about struggling or tight budgets or hard times. But poverty is not abstract. It is highly, violently specific. Poverty is the smell of thick black mold creeping up the cracked bathroom walls of a cramped studio apartment, a smell that gets into your clothes and your hair no matter how much cheap bleach you use. Poverty is the hollow, sharp ache in your stomach because you purposefully skipped dinner for the 3rd night in a row just so your child could have an extra serving of generic brand applesauce. Poverty is doing terrifying mental math every single time you turn on a light switch or run the hot water. Because Diane had cut me off completely, I ended up in a crowded county women's shelter for my first few months. The beds were hard cots, and you had to sleep with your shoes under your pillow so they would not get stolen. I gave birth to my beautiful, perfect daughter, Ruby, in a sterile, chaotic county hospital, entirely alone. There was no one to hold my hand, no one to tell me I was doing a good job. On the intake paperwork, Under the section for emergency contacts, I stared at the blank line for 5 minutes before leaving it empty. Under the section for housing status, the exhausted social worker checked a box with a red pen that said indigent. While Diane was living in her massive 4-bedroom house just 20 minutes across town, sleeping on a plush memory foam mattress and hosting garden club meetings, my newborn daughter spent her first 3 months sleeping in a padded dresser drawer because I absolutely could not afford a crib. I eventually clawed my way out of that shelter. I found a tiny, roach-infested apartment above a laundromat by working grueling, back-breaking double shifts as a waitress at a run-down diner on the edge of town. I walked 4 miles to work in the freezing, biting snow of winter and the blistering, suffocating heat of summer because the early morning bus routes simply did not run out to my cheap neighborhood. I walked in the dark, clutching pepper spray in my pocket, praying I would make it to my shift. At the diner, I endured cruel customers who grabbed my waist when I walked by, and I smiled through tightly gritted teeth as they left me $2 tips. I needed those $2. $2 was a carton of milk. $2 was halfway to a box of the cheapest diapers on the bottom shelf. I lived on government food stamps, WIC appointments where I had to prove how poor I was to get cheese and cereal, and sheer, terrifying maternal adrenaline. My only fragile lifeline during those 5 dark years was my older sister, Valerie. Valerie was still in college, entirely dependent on Diane paying her expensive tuition. If Diane ever found out Valerie was speaking to me, let alone helping me, she would have cut her off financially in a heartbeat, destroying Valerie's future just like she destroyed mine. So, Valerie and I became ghosts to our own family. We would meet secretly at public parks on Sunday mornings, choosing locations on the opposite side of the city. Valerie would bring me second-hand clothes she had found at thrift stores, sneaking them to me in reusable grocery bags so it looked like we had just been shopping. We would sit on cold park benches, Valerie constantly looking over her shoulder every 5 minutes, her eyes wide with the terror of being seen by one of Diane's church friends. She loved Ruby with all her heart, but she was completely paralyzed by the fear of our mother's wrath. I did not blame her. Not for a second. I knew exactly what Diane was capable of. I survived those 5 years by building a massive, impenetrable fortress of emotional armor around myself and my daughter. I learned to trust absolutely no one. I learned to rely on no one. I expected nothing from the universe except what I could bleed for with my own 2 hands. I hardened my heart to survive, becoming a machine that only knew how to work, calculate pennies, and protect my child. Fast forward to the present day. I was 23 years old, hardened by the world, deeply cynical, but incredibly proud of what I had managed to build. Ruby was 5 years old, incredibly bright, funny, and reading far above her kindergarten age level. She was the absolute glowing center of my universe, the reason I kept breathing. I was working a Tuesday afternoon shift at the diner. It was pouring rain outside, a torrential downpour, the kind of gray, miserable day that makes the smell of old fryer grease and stale, burnt coffee inside the restaurant feel even heavier in the air. I was in the back section, wiping down a sticky vinyl booth with a damp rag, my uniform apron permanently stained with ketchup and coffee spots. In my head, I was doing that familiar, exhausting mental math, calculating if I had enough cash in my tip jar to finally fix the broken radiator in my rusty, beat-up car before the winter really set in. The little brass bell above the diner door jingled loudly, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerators. I turned around to grab a laminated menu, and my heart physically stopped beating in my chest. The breath was completely sucked out of my lungs. Walking through the door, shaking the heavy rain off a sleek black umbrella that probably cost more than my entire monthly rent, was a man in a sharply tailored, dark navy suit. He looked older than I remembered, his jawline sharper, his shoulders broader, and he carried an air of undeniable, quiet authority. He looked like a man who owned things. But the face, the eyes, the way he brushed his wet hair out of his face, it was exactly the same. It was Felix. He stood near the entrance, scanning the dingy room, completely oblivious to the outright stares of the regulars sitting at the counter who were definitely not used to seeing custom Italian wool in a place that served $3 pancakes on plastic plates. His eyes swept past the spinning pie display, past the cash register, and finally landed directly on me. I froze entirely. My hand clutched the wet rag so hard dirty water dripped onto my shoes. I wanted the cracked linoleum floor to magically open up and swallow me whole. I was acutely, painfully aware of how I looked. I was exhausted, dangerously underfed, with dark purple bags under my eyes. My hair was tied up in a messy, frizzy bun, and I smelled like cheap fried food in desperation. He did not hesitate. He walked slowly but purposefully toward my section, his eyes locked onto my face like a laser. He slid into the booth I had just finished wiping down. I walked over on shaking legs, my hands trembling so violently that the plastic menus rattled loudly against each other. Before I could even open my mouth to force out a customer service greeting, to ask what he wanted to drink, he looked up at me. His voice was rough, thick with an intense emotion I could not quite identify. He asked, his voice barely a whisper, if I had attended the state university 5 years ago. I could not speak. My throat was completely closed. I could only manage a tiny, weak nod. Felix let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like he had been holding it in for half a decade. He closed his eyes for a second, then looked back at me. He explained, speaking quickly as if he was afraid I would run away, that his full name was Felix, and he was the sole heir to a massive, multi-billion-dollar luxury hotel and real estate empire based in Geneva, Switzerland. He told me that 2 years ago, a mutual friend from that freshman orientation week had posted a massive throwback photo album online. I had happened to be standing in the blurred background of one of the photos, walking past a dorm building. He had seen my face and the memory had hit him like a freight train. He told me he could not let it go. For 2 solid years, he had hired teams of elite private investigators. He had spent tens of thousands of dollars tracking down the quiet American girl he had spent one night with because he could never forget the way I laughed at his terrible jokes. Those investigators had traced my old university records, hit dozens of dead ends because I had dropped off the grid, and finally, after 2 years of searching, traced my recent employment tax records to this exact rundown diner. I stood there gripping the cold metal edge of the diner table, my knuckles turning stark white. He had spent 2 years looking for me. He had hired professionals. The sheer weight of that revelation made the room spin. I felt incredibly dizzy, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly too loud. I slid into the booth across from him, completely ignoring the angry glare of my manager who was watching me from the kitchen service window. I pulled my cracked smartphone from my apron pocket, my fingers trembling so much I could barely unlock the screen. I opened my photo gallery. Without saying a single word, I pushed the phone across the sticky table. It was a picture of Ruby on her 5th birthday. She was missing her front tooth, smiling widely in a cheap purple dress I had bought on a clearance rack. She had my dark, unruly hair, but looking at the screen, and then looking up at the man across from me, the truth was undeniable. She had his exact bright green eyes. She had the exact same distinct dimple on her left cheek when she smiled. Felix stared down at the glowing screen. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, the heir to a Swiss empire, a man who commanded massive corporate boardrooms across Europe, put his face in his large hands right there in booth number 4 of a greasy diner and started crying. He wept openly. His broad shoulders shook with the force of his sobs, completely uncaring of the waitresses or the truck drivers who were watching him. It was a raw, visceral grief for the 5 years he had missed, mixed with an overwhelming shock of discovering he was a father. When he finally pulled himself together, wiping his face with a silk handkerchief, the billionaire went straight to work. His brain clearly operated on solving problems with massive resources. He immediately started talking fast, outlining plans to fix everything instantly. He wanted to buy us a house in a safe, gated neighborhood by the end of the week. He wanted to contact his wealth managers in Geneva to set up a massive, multi-million-dollar trust fund for Ruby's future education. He insisted, his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument, on back paying 5 years of child support, calculating the absolute maximum rate, throwing out the number of $10,000 a month. He was throwing numbers at me that made my head spin, talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars ready to be wired by the end of the business day, as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. My brain, which had been hardwired for extreme poverty and daily survival for half a decade, completely and violently rejected it. My chest tightened with a severe, paralyzing panic attack. For 5 years, money was the terrifying monster hiding under our bed. It was the reason we froze, the reason we starved, the reason I cried myself to sleep. Now, a man in a bespoke suit was sitting across from me offering to slay the monster with a stroke of a gold pen, and it absolutely terrified me. I pushed myself hard against the back of the vinyl booth, away from the table, away from him. I shook my head aggressively. I told him no. My voice was sharp, a weapon I had honed on the streets. I told him we were not taking a single dime of his money until we had lawyers involved. I told him nothing was happening until everything was legally binding, heavily documented, and until I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that this money did not come with invisible strings that could wrap around our necks and hang us later. Felix looked incredibly surprised. He was clearly used to people doing whatever he wanted when he opened his checkbook. But as he looked closely at my hardened expression, the cheap, stained apron, and the rigid, defensive posture I held, he slowly nodded. He realized in that moment that I was not a naive college girl he could just rescue and buy off. I was a mother who had survived a brutal war, and I was not going to surrender my hard-won independence just because he brought a fat bank account. I needed safety, not charity. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you are living in. Every comment helps the video reach more people. Thank you so much. Money, I quickly learned, moves incredibly fast when it wants to. True to his word and under the strict, uncompromising supervision of the legal boundaries I was demanding, Felix bought a beautiful, modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet, safe suburban neighborhood. He did not buy a mansion because I told him a mansion would terrify me. He put the deed entirely and solely in my name. This was a non-negotiable condition I set to ensure that no matter what happened between us, nobody could ever change the locks and kick me out on the street again. Within mere weeks, the quiet suburban neighborhood was buzzing with intense gossip. Felix's presence was simply impossible to miss. There was the sleek, black luxury Mercedes with diplomatic-style plates parked in my driveway. There were the high-end delivery trucks constantly dropping off expensive organic groceries and imported toys. There was the sheer, undeniable aura of European wealth that followed him and his parents when they flew in from Switzerland to meet Ruby for the first time. It did not take long for the neighborhood gossip to bleed across town lines. People talk. Neighbors talked to their cousins at the salon, cousins talked to their coworkers at the bank, and eventually, the whispers of the diner waitress who landed a Swiss billionaire reached the ears of the one person I had prayed to God would never, ever find us. It was a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my new, sunlit kitchen, packing Ruby's lunchbox for her new, highly rated kindergarten, marveling at the fact that I could afford to put fresh strawberries in her bag. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a clean dish towel and walked to the entryway, expecting a delivery driver. I opened the door. Standing on my front porch, holding a massive, extravagant bouquet of expensive white lilies, was my mother, Diane. She looked exactly the same as the day she threw me away. Her hair was perfectly styled, sprayed into submission. Her makeup was flawless, and her clothes were immaculately pressed. She did not even look at my face at first. She looked past my shoulder, her eyes hungrily taking in the gleaming hardwood floors, the expensive stainless steel appliances in the kitchen, and then she glanced back at the luxury sedan parked in the driveway. Only then did she look at me, and immediately, she started crying. It was a perfectly practiced, highly theatrical weeping. She reached out, trying to grab my hands, talking a mile a minute. She babbled endlessly about how much she had missed me, wiping her eyes carefully so as not to smudge her mascara. She talked loudly about the power of forgiveness, about how family is everything and blood is thicker than water. She said she had just been so scared for me when I was 18, claiming she had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic because she only wanted what was best for me. She laid it on incredibly thick, completely ignoring the massive, glaring fact that for 5 solid years, she had lived a mere 20-minute drive away and had happily told all our relatives I was dead to her. She wanted to be a grandmother now. She wanted to be part of our lives, now that being in our lives meant close proximity to a massive Swiss trust fund, luxury cars, and potential European vacations. The sheer audacity of her standing on my porch, smelling of expensive perfume, pretending the last 5 years of my starvation and suffering were just a little misunderstanding, made the blood roar in my ears. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, physically blocking her from taking a single step inside my safe haven. The anger boiling in my stomach was so intense, so hot, I could actually taste copper in my mouth. I was opening my mouth to tell her to go straight to hell when I heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind me. Felix stepped out of the hallway. He was dressed casually in a sweater and jeans, but the authority in his posture was absolutely suffocating. He had been standing in the hall. He had heard every single word of her fake, sickening apology. Diane's eyes lit up the second she saw him. She practically pushed past me, extending her perfectly manicured hand toward him, her face transforming in an instant into a glowing, radiant mask of maternal warmth. She introduced herself with a bright smile, gushing about her precious, beautiful granddaughter and how incredibly thrilled she was to finally blend their families together. She acted like they were old friends meeting at a country club. Felix did not take her hand. He stood there, his hands by his sides, looking at her outstretched hand as if she were offering him a bag of toxic, medical waste. He stepped up right beside me, becoming a solid, immovable wall of support. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice or show any anger. His tone was chillingly quiet, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. He pulled a sleek silver tablet out of his portfolio. He tapped the screen a few times, unlocking it, and held it up right in front of Diane's face. "Are you the woman who threw her pregnant teenager out onto the street in the middle of autumn?" he asked quietly, his accent making the words sound even sharper. Diane stammered, her smile dropping instantly. She started falling back on her rehearsed excuses, mumbling about tough love, about teaching responsibility, about how hard it is to be a single mother. Felix did not let her finish. He swiped to the next screen on his tablet. "This is the official police report from the county shelter," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a razor blade. "It lists your daughter as an abandoned youth. She spent her first 30 days of pregnancy sleeping on a cot surrounded by drug addicts because she was homeless." Diane's face lost all its color, turning a sickly shade of gray. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but Felix swiped again, his eyes never leaving hers. "This is the county social services file showing she had to apply for emergency housing while 8 months pregnant, standing in line for 6 hours. He swiped one more time, showing a scanned hospital document with official stamps. "And this is the medical record from the delivery ward showing she gave birth completely alone, listed in the system as an indigent ward of the state. My private investigators spent 2 full years compiling every single document of your daughter's suffering. I have her food stamp applications. I have the eviction notices she narrowly avoided. I have the medical records of Ruby's malnutrition in her first year. Would you like me to continue reading them out loud to you on this porch?" I stood frozen, gripping the wooden door frame so tightly my fingers ached. I watched my mother's proud, arrogant face completely collapse. The expensive foundation she had carefully applied began to run in ugly, uneven streaks as real tears of profound humiliation mixed with the sweat breaking out on her forehead. The fake facade was utterly shattered. The billionaire she thought she could easily charm and manipulate had just weaponized his immense wealth and resources to drag her deepest, darkest sins into the blazing daylight. She panicked. Total, desperate panic set in. She pivoted hard toward me, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands, begging me to understand. She claimed she thought I would figure it out, claiming she was just angry and didn't mean it, claiming she thought about me every day. I stepped back, completely out of her reach. My voice was surprisingly steady, colder than Felix's. I looked her dead in the eye and told her she needed to get off my property immediately, or I would call the police and have her trespassed. I closed the door right in her face, the solid wooden thud echoing loudly in the hallway. I leaned against the door, my legs finally giving out from the adrenaline, sliding down to the floor. Felix did not say a word. He just sat down right there on the hardwood floor beside me in the entryway, putting his arm around my shoulder, holding me while I finally let myself cry tears of relief and exhaustion. The encounter with Diane terrified me on a level I had not felt in years. Not because I was scared of her physically, but because I knew her deep obsession with appearances and money. Now that she knew about Felix's massive wealth, she would never stop. She would act like a starving vulture circling a fresh kill. She would try to find a way in, and if she couldn't charm her way in, she would force her way in. The very next morning, Felix and I sat in a high-rise, glass-walled office building downtown. We sat across a massive mahogany desk from Carmen. Carmen was a high-powered family law attorney known throughout the city for being absolutely ruthless and completely devoid of sentimentality. I explained the entire situation to her, my mother's sudden reappearance, the massive amount of money Felix was bringing into the picture, and my desperate, overwhelming need to protect Ruby from everyone. And I meant everyone, including Felix if things went sour between us in the future. Carmen did not judge me. She did not tell me I was being dramatic. She just took detailed notes on a yellow legal pad, her face all business. We started building an absolute iron fortress around my life and Ruby's life. First, Carmen scheduled a court-admissible, legally binding DNA test. Even though Felix and I knew the absolute truth, Carmen insisted on a bulletproof paper trail to establish his paternity officially, so no one could ever contest his rights or my rights. Second, we tackled the massive influx of money. Felix agreed immediately, without a single argument, to Carmen's strict terms. The $10,000 a month in back child support would absolutely not go into my personal checking account where it could be questioned, audited, or fought over later by greedy relatives. It was placed directly into a highly secure, legally locked escrow account that would only release funds under strict, legally defined parameters solely for Ruby's education, health, and well-being. Carmen also drafted rock-solid, impenetrable paperwork for the house we were currently living in. The deed was entirely mine, protected by legal clauses that meant Felix could never, ever leverage the property against me, take it back, or use it to force my hand, regardless of what our co-parenting relationship looked like 5 or 10 years down the line. I sat in that expensive leather chair, reading through dense paragraphs of legal jargon that Carmen translated into plain English for me, signing page after page until my hand physically cramped. I was signing away the terrifying vulnerability that had defined my entire adult life. Every signature was a heavy brick in the wall keeping my daughter safe. As we walked out of the law office, stepping into the elevator, Felix looked at me. There was no pity in his eyes, only a profound, deep sense of respect. He realized in that quiet moment that the 5 years I spent in the dark, fighting for scraps, had turned me into someone who planned for the absolute worst-case scenario every single day of her life. I was no longer the frightened, weeping 18-year-old girl sitting on a cold concrete porch with 2 trash bags. I was a mother with a ruthless lawyer, a financial fortress, and a very clear, uncompromising set of rules. And Diane, along with anyone else who tried to threaten our peace, was about to find out exactly how impenetrable those walls had truly become. When you build a brick wall to keep a toxic person out of your life, you have to expect that they will immediately try to find a ladder. Diane was not someone who accepted defeat, especially not when there was an audience involved. Now that she had been completely shut out of my life, blocked from my phone, and legally barred from my property, she realized she could not manipulate me directly. So, she turned to the one place where she could control the entire narrative without any pushback. She turned to social media. A few days after the disastrous encounter on my front porch, my phone buzzed early in the morning. It was a text message from my older sister, Valerie. The message contained dozens of screenshots and a frantic note telling me to look at our mother's public Facebook profile. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping my coffee, and scrolled through the images Valerie had captured. My stomach instantly tied itself into a sickening, familiar knot. Diane had created a massive, public photo album titled My Precious Girls and the Importance of Family. It was a masterpiece of absolute, unhinged delusion. The album contained over 50 photos of Valerie and me. But as I looked closer, I realized every single photo of me was at least 10 years old. There were pictures from my middle school graduation, photos of us sitting around a Christmas tree when I was 12, and images of me wearing braces at a family picnic. There was not a single photograph from the last 5 years, because she had not been in my life for the last 5 years. To anyone who did not know the dark, ugly truth, the album painted a picture of a deeply devoted, loving mother who was currently experiencing the heartbreaking tragedy of being alienated from her beloved daughter and her unknown grandchild. The captions were even worse than the photos. Diane wrote long, emotional paragraphs about how much she cherished her daughters, how a mother's love is completely unconditional, and how she was praying every single day for her family to be fully reunited. She deliberately used religious language, playing the role of the martyred, suffering mother for her church friends and our extended relatives. The comment section was a nightmare. Dozens of aunts, uncles, and family friends were leaving comments about how strong she was, how cruel I was being for keeping my daughter a secret, and how I would eventually realize the terrible mistake I was making by shutting out such a wonderful, supportive grandmother. It was a brilliant, highly calculated smear campaign. She was actively rewriting history for everyone who did not know the truth, painting me as a bitter, vindictive child who was punishing her for no reason. I felt completely sick reading it, seeing her manipulate our entire extended family so effortlessly. But this time, instead of spiraling into my old patterns of self-doubt and intense anxiety, I did something different. I saved every single screenshot to a secure folder on my laptop labeled Evidence. Valerie called me on her lunch break later that afternoon. She was crying. For 5 years, Valerie had been terrified of our mother, sneaking around just to bring my daughter secondhand clothes. But seeing Diane weaponize our childhood photos to play the victim had finally snapped something inside her. Valerie told me she had printed out the screenshots, walked right into Diane's house, and thrown them on the dining room table. She told our mother that she was completely done playing her twisted games. Valerie told Diane that she was cutting herself off, that she did not want another single dime of tuition money, and that she would take out student loans to finish her last semester of college rather than be owned by a woman who could lie so effortlessly to the world. It was a massive, terrifying step for my sister, but it brought us closer than we had ever been. We were finally a united front, standing on the outside of Diane's web of lies, gathering every piece of evidence we could find. While I was dealing with my mother's psychological warfare online, Felix and I were trying to navigate the incredibly complex, uncharted territory of co-parenting. Felix was a good man, I genuinely believed that, but he was also a man who had never been told no in his entire adult life. He was completely accustomed to solving every single problem, soothing every single hurt, and bridging every single gap by throwing massive amounts of money at it. One evening, after Ruby had gone to sleep, Felix came over to my house holding a thick, glossy catalog from an exclusive European toy manufacturer. We sat at the kitchen table, and he proudly opened the catalog to a page he had bookmarked with a sticky note. It was a Victorian-style wooden dollhouse. Calling it a dollhouse felt like an insult. It was a miniature architectural masterpiece. It stood 4 feet tall, had fully functioning miniature electric lights, hand-carved mahogany furniture, real silk curtains, and a price tag of exactly $3,000. He pointed to it with a huge smile, telling me he had already spoken to the manufacturer in Germany and could have it custom shipped and assembled in Ruby's bedroom by the end of the month. He said she deserved the most beautiful things in the world after the years we had struggled. I stared at the price tag and my chest seized up. $3,000 was more than 2 full months of rent at my old, roach-infested apartment. It was more than I had spent on groceries in an entire year during our darkest times. I looked at Felix, who was beaming with the anticipation of being the hero, and I had to take a deep breath. I told him no. I told him it was too much, too fast, and completely unnecessary. I explained that Ruby was 5 years old, that she was a normal, happy kid who would be just as thrilled playing with a $30 plastic castle from a local big box store. Felix looked genuinely confused and a little hurt. His smile dropped. He started to argue, explaining that he could easily afford it, that the cost meant absolutely nothing to him, and that he just wanted to give her the world. I reached across the table and put my hand over his to stop him from talking. I looked him dead in the eye and explained that throwing expensive things at a child does not buy their love, nor does it create a meaningful bond. I told him about growing up in Diane's house. Diane had bought me expensive clothes and nice things, but she had never once sat on the floor to play with me. She had never asked me about my day. I told Felix that what Ruby desperately needed was not a miniature mansion she was not allowed to break. She needed a father who would sit cross-legged on a cheap rug and help her build a messy, crooked tower out of plastic blocks. She needed him, his time, and his attention, not his bank account. He sat there in total silence for a long time, staring at the glossy page. I could see his wealthy, corporate mindset actively battling with the reality of being a present father. Finally, he slowly closed the catalog. He did not push back. He did not get angry. Instead, he asked me, with complete sincerity, what he should do instead. I told him to cancel the dollhouse. I suggested he plan a simple Saturday trip to the local Children's Science Museum, the one with the cheap interactive exhibits where kids can get their hands dirty. I told him to buy her a hot dog from the food court and spend 3 hours answering her endless questions about dinosaur bones. That weekend, he did exactly that. He came back exhausted, covered in a mysterious sticky substance, but Ruby was absolutely glowing with joy. That willingness to hear me, to completely adjust his worldview, and to learn how to be a real dad instead of just a rich benefactor, mattered to me more than any amount of money he could ever put in a trust fund. The peace we were slowly trying to build was shattered on a Thursday afternoon during my lunch shift at the diner. I was carrying a heavy tray of plates when I felt my phone violently vibrating in my apron pocket. I managed to set the tray down at a table and checked the screen. It was a call from Ruby's kindergarten. My heart instantly dropped into my stomach. When the school calls in the middle of the day, it is never good news. I rushed into the cramped employee break room and answered the phone, my voice tight with panic. The school administrator sounded calm, but very firm. She explained that a woman claiming to be Ruby's grandmother had just shown up at the front office, demanding to ask questions about the school's afternoon pickup procedures and requesting a copy of Ruby's daily schedule. My blood ran completely cold. Diane. She had actually tracked down where my 5-year-old daughter went to school. I told the administrator that it was an absolute emergency and that I was on my way. I hung up, ripped off my ketchup-stained apron, told my manager I was leaving, and practically sprinted to my car. I drove the 6 blocks to the elementary school with my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I burst through the front doors of the school office, the administrator assured me that they had not released a single piece of information and had turned the woman away, but Diane had caused a minor scene in the lobby about family rights before leaving. I sat down at the front desk, my hands trembling with protective, primal rage, and filled out a mountain of security paperwork. I established a strict lockdown protocol. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was allowed to pick up Ruby or even ask about her unless it was me or Felix, and we established a secret password system with the teachers. But Diane's ambush at the school was only the beginning of the nightmare that week. 2 days later, A local online gossip blog published a blind item article. The post did not use our full names, but it described a wealthy European hotel heir who had recently parked his custom Mercedes outside a local diner to claim a secret love child with a waitress. The details were far too specific to be a coincidence. Diane had realized she could not get to me through the school, so she had anonymously leaked the story to the local internet tabloids to humiliate me. By Friday evening, the diner was buzzing. 2 regular customers, men who usually just drank black coffee and complained about the weather, sat in my section and started whispering just loud enough for me to hear. When I walked over to refill their mugs, one of them smirked at me and made a loud, incredibly vulgar comment, asking if I was sure I had not trapped the Swiss guy on purpose to secure a payday. I froze, the heavy glass coffee pot shaking in my hand. My face burned with intense humiliation, but before I could even respond, my manager marched out of the kitchen. She told the men their meals were canceled, ordered them to leave the diner immediately, and threatened to call the police if they ever harassed her staff again. I spent my break crying in the bathroom, feeling like my entire life was being dragged through the mud. I called Carmen, the lawyer, from a bathroom stall. Carmen was completely unfazed. She told me to activate our privacy plan. Within 48 hours, Carmen's law firm issued terrifying, heavily worded cease and desist letters to the gossip blog, threatening massive defamation lawsuits funded by Felix's bottomless legal budget. The blog post vanished the next morning. A second, even harsher cease and desist letter was hand-delivered by a process server to Diane's front door, officially warning her that any further attempts to contact Ruby's school or leak private family information would result in immediate, severe legal action for harassment. The message was loud and clear: play stupid games with a billionaire's lawyers, win incredibly painful prizes. If there is one thing a narcissist absolutely despises, it is a boundary they cannot break. The cease and desist letter backed Diane into a corner, but instead of retreating, she decided to escalate the war. A week after the school incident, I received a thick, certified envelope in the mail. It was a formal letter of intent from a cheap, local attorney Diane had hired. The letter stated that Diane was preparing to file a petition with the family court to sue for grandparents' rights, demanding court-ordered, unsupervised visitation with Ruby. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the legal letter, feeling a heavy, suffocating wave of exhaustion wash over me. The mere idea of being dragged into a courtroom, of having a judge dissect my life and potentially force me to hand my daughter over to the woman who had intentionally made me homeless, made me physically nauseous. I called Carmen immediately, my voice frantic. Carmen told me to come to her office, and Felix met me there. When we sat down, Carmen slid the letter across the desk and laughed, a dry, humorless sound. She explained that the laws regarding grandparents' rights in our specific state were extremely narrow. A grandparent had to prove an existing, deeply established relationship with the child, or prove that denying contact would cause the child severe psychological harm. Diane had absolutely neither of those things. She had never even met Ruby properly. Carmen assured me, with complete confidence, that Diane's case was incredibly weak and that any judge would throw it out of court. However, Carmen also gave me a harsh reality check. She warned me that even a weak lawsuit could drag on for months. It would require depositions, psychological evaluations for Ruby, and thousands of dollars in legal fees. While Felix could easily afford the fees, the emotional toll on me and my daughter would be devastating. Diane knew this. The lawsuit was not about winning, it was about bleeding me dry emotionally until I simply gave up and gave her what she wanted. Carmen presented a strategic alternative. She suggested we offer formal, professional mediation as a good faith gesture. By offering mediation, we would create a legally documented paper trail proving that we were being reasonable and cooperative, while forcing Diane into a controlled environment where her manipulation tactics would not work. I agreed to the mediation, but I set absolute, uncompromising conditions. I told Carmen that I would not sit in a room and listen to my mother make excuses. If we were going to do this, Diane had to follow my rules. We hired Dr. Harrison, an elite, highly respected family mediator and psychologist who specialized in toxic family dynamics. The ground rules were written directly into the mediation agreement. Diane had to acknowledge her specific, cruel actions on paper. She was explicitly forbidden from using the word, and she was not allowed to say, "I was just trying to help." If she broke those rules, the mediation would end immediately, and we would bury her in court. To my absolute shock, Diane's cheap lawyer reviewed the incredibly strict terms, and Diane actually agreed to attend. She was so supremely confident in her ability to charm her way out of trouble that she thought she could manipulate a professional psychologist. She was about to be proven very, very wrong. The mediation session took place on a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Harrison's sterile, gray conference room. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, the silence in the room heavy enough to choke on. Diane arrived exactly on time, wearing a conservative, expensive dress, clutching a tissue in her hand, fully prepared to play the role of the grieving mother. I sat across the wide table from her, keeping my face completely blank. Dr. Harrison sat at the head of the table, reviewing the strict ground rules we had agreed upon. Dr. Harrison started the session by asking Diane to read from the assignment she had been given. She was required to bring a written list of her specific actions over the past 5 years. Diane opened her folder, her hands shaking slightly. She tried to start with a preamble about how hard it is to be a parent, but Dr. Harrison cut her off immediately, his voice professional but entirely unyielding, reminding her of the rules. No justifications. Just the facts. So, Diane had to read it. Her voice cracked as she started reading the handwritten pages. She had to say, out loud, in front of a professional, that she kicked her pregnant 18-year-old daughter out of the house with exactly 2 hours' notice. She had to read the words admitting that she changed the locks so I could not return. She had to confess that she ignored calls from my sister begging for help to get me into a shelter. She had to admit that she told our extended family I had run away to Las Vegas to cover up the fact that she had made me homeless. She had to say that she lived 20 minutes away for 5 whole years and never once checked hospital records to see if I had survived giving birth alone. She cried genuinely while reading it. It was incredibly painful, humiliating work, and she struggled deeply with the urge to defend herself. Every time she tried to slip a justification into her reading, Dr. Harrison gently but firmly corrected her, forcing her back to the raw, ugly truth of her actions. When she finally finished reading the 3 pages, she looked across the table at me. Her face was red, her makeup ruined. She said she was deeply sorry for every single specific thing she had done. I sat there, letting the heavy, painful words land in the quiet room. I did not rush to make her feel better. I did not reach across the table to hold her hand. I did not tell her everything was okay, because it absolutely was not okay. My childhood was gone, and 5 years of my life had been a nightmare because of her choices. After a very long, uncomfortable silence, I finally spoke. I told her that I heard her words, and I accepted them as a baseline of truth, but I absolutely did not forgive her. I told her that forgiveness was not a magical switch she could flip just by reading a piece of paper. Instead of a happy reunion, I laid out my terms. I set a strict 6-month probation period. Diane was required to attend mandatory, intense therapy sessions with Dr. Harrison every single week for 6 months. She had to provide proof of attendance. During that time, there would be absolutely no contact with Ruby. Only if she completed the 6 months, and only if Dr. Harrison signed off confirming that she was making genuine psychological progress and understanding her toxic behavior, would I consider allowing a single, 30-minute supervised visit. Diane looked stunned. She had expected to cry, apologize, and be instantly welcomed to family dinners. But she looked at my cold expression, looked at Dr. Harrison's neutral face, and realized she had absolutely no leverage left. If she wanted even a fraction of a relationship with her granddaughter, she had to earn it through grueling, sustained effort. She slowly nodded, agreeing to the terms. 6 months is a very long time to maintain a lie. I fully expected Diane to quit therapy after 3 weeks, complain that it was too hard, or claim that I was being completely unreasonable. But to my genuine surprise, the weekly attendance confirmations from Dr. Harrison kept arriving in my email inbox. She showed up to every single session. Dr. Harrison's monthly reports remained incredibly neutral, noting that real psychological change takes years, not months, but confirming that Diane was engaging seriously with the work and slowly beginning to dismantle her narcissistic defense mechanisms. Because she had strictly followed every single rule without pushing back, without sending secret gifts, and without trying to bypass my boundaries, I kept my end of the bargain. When Ruby's 6th birthday arrived, I approved a highly structured, 30-minute supervised visit. We hosted Ruby's birthday party at a local public park pavilion on a bright Saturday morning. I deliberately chose not to have a massive, catered event. Felix arrived early, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and spent an hour enthusiastically blowing up cheap, dollar store balloons and taping colorful paper streamers to the wooden posts. He was fully embracing normal life, actively choosing to be a regular dad rather than a rich benefactor. Ruby ran around the grass with her kindergarten friends, playing tag, screaming with laughter, her face covered in cheap grocery store cake frosting. At exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, Diane arrived. She parked her car and walked toward the pavilion. My entire body tensed up, my protective instincts instantly flaring. I stood near the picnic tables, watching her every move. Diane followed the rules to the absolute letter. She did not bring a massive pile of expensive presents to try and buy Ruby's affection. She stayed at the edge of the pavilion, keeping a respectful physical distance. When Ruby ran over to get a drink of water, I formally introduced them. I kept my voice light and normal, simply telling Ruby that this was her grandmother. Ruby, being a curious 6-year-old, said a quick hello, showed Diane a plastic toy ring she had won in a game, and then immediately ran back to her friends to play musical chairs. Diane did not try to force a hug. She did not try to pull Ruby onto her lap. She just stood there, holding her purse, smiling a genuine, somewhat sad smile as she watched her granddaughter run around in the sunshine. When exactly 30 minutes had passed, Diane caught my eye, gave a small, respectful nod, and turned around. She walked back to her car and drove away without a single ounce of drama, without begging for more time, and without trying to guilt-trip me. I stood there holding a stack of paper plates, watching her car disappear down the street. I felt a very strange, unfamiliar sensation in my chest. It was not forgiveness. I was far too damaged to fully forgive her yet. But it was a tiny, fragile sliver of hope. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, if we kept these massive, ironclad boundaries in place, we could exist in the same universe without destroying each other. It was not the picture-perfect, movie-ending family reunion, but it was safe, and for the first time in my life, safe felt like enough. The logistics of our new, highly structured life slowly began to settle into a steady, reliable rhythm. The week after Ruby's birthday, I walked out to my mailbox and found a crisp white envelope from the local community college. I stood in my driveway, my hands shaking just like they did on the diner shift, and tore it open. It was an official acceptance letter. After 5 years of believing my academic future was completely dead and buried, I was officially enrolled for the spring semester to study accounting. Because of the massive financial security provided by the heavily monitored trust fund and the child support, the crushing, suffocating stress of survival had finally lifted off my shoulders. I sat down with my manager at the diner and formally adjusted my schedule. I dropped the grueling evening shifts that kept me away from Ruby at bedtime and switched entirely to the busy, lucrative lunch shifts while she was safe at school. I could finally afford to buy heavy college textbooks without having to brutally choose between education and groceries. Felix eventually had to fly back to Geneva to manage his family's massive hotel empire. The reality of dating a billionaire is that they actually have to work. On his last night in town, instead of buying expensive farewell gifts, he and I sat on the floor of Ruby's bedroom. We bought a giant, blank monthly calendar and 2 massive sheets of cheap, colorful stickers from a craft store. Felix patiently sat with Ruby, letting her place a bright gold star on every single day he was going to fly back to visit, and a purple heart on the days they were going to have long video calls. We taped the heavily decorated calendar to the wall right next to her bed. That simple, cheap piece of paper gave my daughter something concrete and reliable to track. It turned the terrifying concept of her father's absence into a manageable, predictable routine. She knew exactly when to expect him, and because Felix was terrified of losing us, he never missed a single scheduled call. Late one evening, after the house was completely quiet and Ruby was fast asleep, I sat in my living room with all the lights off, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the terrifying, roach-infested studio apartment we used to live in. I thought about the nights I cried from hunger and the mornings I walked miles in the dark. Those memories did not magically fade away just because I had a nice couch and a stable bank account now, and honestly, I never wanted them to fade. I needed to remember exactly where we had been, because it fueled my absolute refusal to ever take this stability for granted. Our new normal was incredibly messy, intensely structured, and completely ours. Ruby had two parents who communicated respectfully and put her emotional needs far above their own egos. She had an aunt who was finally free to be a real friend, and a grandmother who was slowly, painfully earning her way back into our lives from a very safe distance. And she had a mother who had survived absolute hell, who had fought tooth and nail for every single inch of peace, and who knew exactly what it cost to build a fortress. The ground beneath my feet finally felt solid, and I knew that no one was ever going to change the locks on me again. Was I too harsh for forcing my mother to jump through intense psychological evaluations and massive legal threats just to see her own granddaughter for 30 minutes? Or was I completely justified in aggressively protecting the peace I spent 5 years bleeding for? Let me know whose side you are on down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories.